So, Ryan, hello, welcome to Ukraine again, or shall I say Professor Coles, right?
No, thank you. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, it's a great pleasure for us to host you again at the business school, and I would like to give a little bit of context for our viewers on this channel about your lab, your work at UConn, and your projects all around the world, because as I know you travel a lot.
Yeah.
So can you give like short explanation of what Daigle Labs do and what is your key focus and interest and scientific, interest points which you follow?
Yeah, and I'll start with the latter, right? We are first and foremost a research lab. So I'm an organizational sociologist, and my focus is on how do you build businesses in different markets around the world, and how do you build businesses around emerging science and technology. And I got into that space, like you said, because I started traveling frequently. One of my first forays into entrepreneurship was a situation where we were operating in a different foreign country from day one, right? And that's a relatively new phenomenon. It used to be you start a company, you're probably servicing your local market. Over time, you grow a bit bigger, so you're servicing a regional market. Maybe you grow big enough for a national market, and there's very few that would grow big enough to then go international. Nowadays, it's a very interconnected world, and you have these situations like I lived through at 24, where starting a business, you're starting a business, and day one, you're like, okay, we're starting this business to operate in a country outside of ours right away, right? Which is, and internationalizing as a young, insecure business is very different than internationalizing as a big incumbent corporation. And so that experience that I lived through made me think about how I wanted to understand how to do it better. And that's when I got into academia. And then while I did my PhD at Cornell, I got familiar with Robert Langer, who was a Cornell alum. He was a professor at MIT in biomedical engineering. And his lab was really good at doing academic research and then building companies around it. And I thought, that's fascinating, right? And so much of that process is a social process. Inventing the technology requires a lot of technical know-how. But when you go to build a business organization around some new science and technology, that takes a lot of social know-how. And so I saw a space where I, as a sociologist, could learn and bring a lot of insight. So when I got to UConn, I started a lab that focused on that. And we did a lot of great work. We had back-to-back best papers, best entrepreneurship paper in the Academy of Management. And that happens very rarely. Very rarely do you win best entrepreneurship paper in the entire Academy of Business Professors worldwide back-to-back. So we were doing really good academic work. And in January of 2023, we kind of moved into venture building space because we thought, all right, we're learning from our academic research. Let's see if we can apply what we're learning and experiment with building businesses around new science and technology. We kind of had this framework. And the framework included globalization, right? What we saw was when you're a new tech company, sometimes it's hard to go and compete in mainstream markets. And so let's go to downstream to geographies or places around the world where you don't have as much competition. You can get traction there, and then you'll move upstream. And so we started to try that. We in 2023 took on 8 startup projects, ranging from ag tech to biomaterials to AI. Some of them had revenue, some of them were pre-revenue and pre-product, right? The product wasn't even finished yet. And we helped those 8 startup projects get over $700 million in new sales contracts with our philosophy in 1 year. And you know, then by the end of 2023, we started to get a lot of attention. So now we're working with IBM, Johnson & Johnson, Aramco, and SpaceX on technology commercialization projects. And so I think our framework is proving out. It's getting a lot of traction. There's a lot of interest around how we do it. So it's fun, but that's what Daigle Labs is. We do the research on it, and then we go out and experiment with building businesses around new science and technology.
Thank you for this description. I will ask about the product's commercialization a little bit later, but I would like to somehow say that what you're doing at Daigle Labs is very close to what we're experiencing here in Ukraine, because a lot of companies from the day one, they decide to go to the foreign market and to serve the foreign market. According to Friedman, as you probably know, the world is flat already. And like see all these tech giants in Ukraine, most of them selling their software or hardware products all around the world, but not in Ukraine, because Ukraine is a very small, underserved market. So this is very close of what we are experiencing here in the local market, especially in high-tech industry. And what do you think? Is it valid more to the underdeveloped economies, or it's very, you know, actual all around the world, including the developed countries as the U.S.?
Yeah, and so I think you bring a really good point, and it's a really good question. And I think it's one reason why, if you look at around the world, a lot of countries aspire to have high growth tech startups like they see in Silicon Valley. But what's interesting is when they try to take the Silicon Valley model to some of these different countries, it doesn't really work. One of those reasons, we'll get into, I'll talk about two big reasons. One of those reasons is kind of what you highlighted. Well, look, in the US, it's a big market. It's 320 million people or 330 million people. It's, in terms of land mass, the second or third largest country in the world, right? So it's a massive domestic market. And so if I'm practicing high growth tech startup entrepreneurship, because if you want Silicon Valley style, high growth, billion-dollar unicorns, they've got to grow big, they've got to grow fast. And they can do that by practicing a typical entrepreneurship that isn't global, right? And so if you just translate that wholesale to another country that's much smaller, it's not going to work really well, because you bring in venture capitalists and they're not going to invest in a tech startup that isn't going billion-dollar quickly. And you can't do that if you're not practicing international entrepreneurship in a small country. And so I think now we're just catching up, where we realize, hey, if we want high-growth tech startups in our economy, we need to be, in our situation, let's say if I'm in a smaller country, it could be Jordan, Ecuador, Peru, Ukraine, it could be, where are we else? Nepal, right? We're in all these different countries. It's like, look, you've got to be working with your entrepreneurs on international entrepreneurship. You've got to help them practice this particular style, right? Or else you're not going to get the results that you want. I think, real quick, the other piece, though, that's missing, if we look at entrepreneurship for economic development, and you know, I've said this many times before, for entrepreneurship to work, to increase jobs broadly, increase wages broadly, you have to focus on high growth tech startups, but you need a rigorous ecosystem for small and medium-sized businesses around it, so that all of those kind of gains from like a tech unicorn can be shared, because you've got a robust small and medium-sized business ecosystem around it. And oftentimes what happens when you have a high-growth tech startup without a rigorous small and medium-sized business ecosystem, all of those economic gains end up going outside the community where that startup's located, right?
We in Ukraine live in a war. with very severe consequences.
Yeah.
And I would like to ask you, what of your research about doing entrepreneurship in harsh environments can teach us about how Ukrainian entrepreneurs have to behave, even having all of these obstacles. You know, men cannot travel through the borders. We have mobilization, and army needs people to fight this war. We are under very serious financial, you know, hardships in different spheres and industries. So what would you recommend for entrepreneurs to do, having all of these obstacles on the way?
Yeah, and you know, you mentioned earlier about getting into my experience, you know, from last year to this year. You know, it's been a year, and what I've seen and what's changed. One thing that I've seen is coming here now versus May 2023 is the labor market issue is exasperated, right? When I was here in May 2023, it may have been an issue, but I don't think it was as intense as you mentioned, right? Where, you know, now I'm observing in Ukraine where you have, for the first time, women taking jobs in what have been historically, before the war, very, very male-dominated industries in Ukraine, right? And it's, and you know, it's not because of social change, right? Like, oh, people are, you know, it's just necessity, right? There's just no men to fill the jobs, and so I make a note of that. That's one challenge, and that's one thing that I've seen that's become exasperated. And I think, broadly speaking, when you're an entrepreneur operating in a context where there's intense political instability and violence, first thing is you have to have your practice of how you maintain some sort of mental clarity, mental health, because everything cascades after that. If you don't have that clarity or some sort of ritual to keep you grounded so that you can make good decisions about whatever comes at you that day, my experience is you can be the smartest person in the world, but for that knowledge to translate to good decisions and behavior, it goes through that mechanism of mental health, right? Because if you don't have good mental health, or you don't have your ritual for trying to maintain some sort of groundedness, that knowledge in your brain about how to operate a business won't be applied effectively. And so I think that's fundamental. You build on top of that the emphasis on short-term tactical operational planning. It's easy sometimes if you're just casually looking at Bloomberg or HBR to be directed towards more high-level vision planning for your business, right? Where do you want to be disruptive? And that's great. But what our research has shown is, and this was research from violent communities in Latin America, our research has shown that that type of strategic planning, when you're operating in a zone of high volatility, political violence, is actually detrimental to your business's survival. You need to step back, put that stuff on the shelf, and you need to be planning day to day, at most week to week, very operational. In terms of keeping and maintaining your talent, I think you've got to put more of an emphasis on a flexible workplace, right? How can you set up ways where it's flexible for your team to be remote or present? And your leadership style has to change. I think it can be easy as a business operator to move into a very managerial, procedural, and bureaucratic leadership style. In a situation like this, you have to be more human. you have to shift to that servant leadership archetype. And there's a lot of great work on what that is and what that archetype is. And I would kind of encourage founders, entrepreneurs, business leaders, business operators in Ukraine to dig into that leadership archetype, because that's the type of leadership that's needed to successfully manage your team and your talent right now. They need that. In terms of organizational structure, our research has shown that a very clear and strong hierarchy is super helpful right now. Psychologically, for other employees in a business, there can be comfort about knowing who's in charge, who I report to, who's making decisions. It provides a sense of security. And just think on the military side of things. Hierarchy becomes really important when you need to pivot and move fast, right? Because that person leading in a strong hierarchy can say, okay, we got to go here, and everyone just goes, because there's not a lot of time to deliberate. You got to move fast, you got to move quick. And deliberation is good, but you've got to know when to dissolve hierarchy and deliberate, and when to impose hierarchy and move quick and fast. And this is one of those periods where, as a business, just like as a military or government, we got to move quick and fast. There isn't much time for deliberation. And so now's the time to create org structures where there's maybe a stronger and more clear hierarchy. You know, the last thing that I'll mention is flexibility. So flexibility around division of labor. So clear hierarchy, right? We know who reports to who's in charge. And at the same time, the job descriptions of each person should be somewhat flexible. Not where they have no job title and no job description whatsoever, but there's that in-between space. You don't want to be at the extreme where it's very specific, because, you know, again, we're in a point of volatility. We've got to be flexible. So if I have a very rigid job description and you come to me as my manager and leader and say, okay, I need you to do this, I might go, well, no, that doesn't fit in my 20-point job description, right? and it's like, wait, we don't have time. I just need you to do this. So you want strong hierarchy, moderately formalized division of labor, and that's that sweet spot in terms of org design.
So among your topics, one of the main things you're doing is technology commercialization and turning the academic research or science, you know, into the real products in the world. So what would you recommend the countries with weak scientific systems or research-based institutions or underdeveloped institutions to foster when they want to do something like this and follow the marvelous Silicon Valley and all of this Stanford, MIT examples?
Yeah, so let's see, where to begin? One, make sure you take the right lessons away from that history. I think a lot of people, when they look to that phenomenon, they don't look at the full history, and they sometimes take the wrong lessons away. I'll give you a quick story on this. I was in a country, I won't name where, but I was touring an incubator, and their big thing was we want to Google. We want to make companies like Google. Great. And they're like, so look at this building that we've got, and just like Google headquarters, there's our ping pong tables. You can take a slide from the second floor to the first floor, and there's our free food and candy. And we kind of had to slow them down because, again, they looked over at Silicon Valley, they saw Google, and they're like, how do we get a Google? And they just said, okay, look at their headquarters, so we're just going to mimic that. Bright colors, free food, slides, ping pong tables, and it was like you kind of misattributing what led to Google. Those things happened after, right? Those weren't inputs, those were kind of outputs. And where did Google come from? It was a US government grant to 2 PhD students at Stanford and their professor. Right? And with that federal grant to do research, they developed the basis of what was Google. Right? And so that's one of the key things is when you look at that history, you need to realize there was a lot of public-private coordination involved in producing what you see today as Silicon Valley. Right? When you look at biotech, let's say in San Diego, a lot of US government funding went into the discoveries that became the foundation of all of that biotechnology industry, both in Boston and in San Diego. And so first step is governments around the world need to prioritize basic funding of academic research, because academic research is important. That basic science is important. It's kind of like if I give you, if you're the innovator, you're the person that's building the tech company, wanting to commercialize science and technology, and I'm a competitor wanting to do the same thing, and I get 100 Lego bricks, different types of Lego bricks, and you only get 5 Lego bricks that are all the same, I've got a lot more to work with, right? That's that basic science. The more basic science that's happening around you, you have a lot more to work with. And even though the world is flat, our research shows that knowledge isn't exactly transferable. Sure, there's patents. Sure, there's academic papers. But there's so much more implicit knowledge that isn't in the patent, right? And that's critical if you're trying to build a company around it. And that only travels so far, right? About the length of a commute, because a person is a person. That's where all that implicit knowledge is. It's still in that professor's head. And so that's why these places cluster, right? You're not getting, you don't see, I don't know if you know Robert Langer, I mentioned it before, right? One of the most cited, he's like the 4th most cited scientist in human history, right? Co-founder of Moderna. Why isn't there a Langer company? Because over 30 companies have been founded based on his inventions. Where are they? They're in Boston, around MIT, where he is. There's a reason why there isn't a Langer-backed company in China or India or Mexico. It's too far from Bob. But they could look at his patents just like anybody else. So it clusters. And so it's not enough to rely on, and this goes back to like we're moving, we globalize and then we're kind of relocalizing again. You cannot rely on the US or other European countries or China to invest big in research, because that'll only benefit them. It doesn't spill over that far. So first thing, increase your funding for basic academic research. Second thing, on your campuses, you should open, you want a technology licensing office, right? Because what's going on at Ukrainian Catholic University, great research, right? The Kiev School of Economics, like a lot of great researchers, Nobel Prize winners. Okay, good. We need to make sure that we have an office on these campuses that supports patenting those things, right? Organizing those things. Now, I've done research around technology licensing offices at universities and American universities. And I'm going to tell you that we found that most of them are not very useful or successful. So now I know you're going to, the obvious next question is, well, then why are you recommending that we do it? My recommendation is that's necessary but not sufficient. The problem with technology licensing offices at American universities is they're staffed with engineers. They're not staffed with business professors or business experts or management experts. And our research shows that tech commercialization goes twice as fast when you start to tone down the engineering and technical rhetoric and you ramp up the management and business involvement. And so what I would do, if I had this great opportunity in Ukraine to kind of build it from the ground up, because it's hard to change something once it's kind of built, I would set up technology licensing offices with business professors involved, with business people involved in the office, right? Make it, you know, half engineers, half business people, and get them more involved in the tech commercialization process. And that's going to help you get academic research transformed into commercial goods and services.
That's a very interesting point. Ukrainian Catholic University, as you know, is a private institution.
Yeah.
But anyway, the role of government is critical and super important. What do you think? There is this common legend, which is probably truth, that everything, internet and all of these high technologies and the Silicon Valley as it is, was born because of all of huge projects like DARPA and ARPA and everything was invested by the government and into this research and brilliant professors who was doing this research. So, and this was all around Miltech and around something which is connected to fighting the modern war.
Yeah.
And this military technology then transferred into the civic needs.
Right.
So what do you think, having this this war in Ukraine and this newly developed technologies, can it have this spark of development and then reorienting this technology into civic tech right now in Ukraine? What is your prognosis? Can you somehow reflect on this a little bit?
Yeah, I think now there's definitely an opportunity for that here, because I think you kind of nailed the narrative right. One of the reasons, if you look back at history, one of the things that propelled the United States in that direction were these moments of, for lack of a better word, existential threat. We came out of World War II, and you had successive presidents like Eisenhower who were adamant on continued major investments in science and technology because they saw it as critical for national security. And that you need an impetus, because investment in basic research is hard for a politician to sell. Right? And so, but when you have these major existential threats, another one later in the 1960s with John F. Kennedy, the Soviets launched something into space that was, for our nation, an existential threat at the time. And so JFK was able to mobilize and sell massive investment in science research, right? That otherwise, again, it's hard to sell to the public. It's hard to say to a constituent, all right, we're going to give this guy a bunch of money to do some research way out in the realm of discovery that may or may not impact anything. It might fail. And they're sitting there going, really, I just want to tax. They'll feel the tax break right away, right? Even though that's got a much better economic payoff, it's hard to feel that. So it's hard to sell. But when you have these existential threats, all of a sudden, even the politicians feel the need to invest in cutting-edge something. And so Ukraine, I think, is in that moment, definitely. And it's been one of the highlights of the war to see the ingenuity of Ukrainians and the Ukrainian military in the use of drones and AI. And so I think that's going to put you at the cutting edge. And what we want to do is to continue to make those investments, and hopefully it's part of the U.S. aid to Ukraine. You know, if I was on Capitol advocating another aid package, which I hope we do, it should include funding for research for Ukrainians doing the research in Ukraine. I think fully fulfilling it, we want to make sure that any incubator or accelerator trying to take that knowledge, that you're training in international entrepreneurship, because that'll be the difference between U.S. versus Ukrainian model. Again, when the U.S. went through those existential threats, and you had those bursts in scientific research, our entrepreneurs that were taking that military research and turning it into commercial products didn't have to practice international entrepreneurship. And so for me, that could be one point where maybe we don't quite realize the potential of the moment in Ukraine. It could fail to fully realize if the Ukrainian entrepreneur trying to transform that military research into a commercial good isn't practicing international entrepreneurship because the domestic market might not be big enough, right, to blow it up.
So how AI revolution can help with all of this, with this, you know, like progress of doing amazing products from Ukraine to the world? Is that any insight on this?
Yeah, so I think in terms of the entrepreneurial process, it can do a couple of things. One, research has shown that use of AI tools is particularly useful in elevating the productivity of like the bottom third of the talent pool, which is good because that means the pool of nascent entrepreneurs in a place like Ukraine goes up, right? Because now that slice of the talent pool that otherwise, for lack of a better word, may not be talented enough, now with the use of AI can become talented enough, and you want to just increase that pool of nascent entrepreneurs, right? So that's good. The other thing is AI tools can now free up that founder or founding team and give them more time to focus on things like making global connections, getting out there and finding that first client, as opposed to having to spend more time and energy on internal administrative things. So that's a good thing. What I think it also does is it creates possibilities of commercializing a whole new host of products. I think you go back just 2 years, a social scientist like me, it was hard to think through how do you commercialize my research, right? Easy to think through how you commercialize Bob Langer's research. There's a clear, you patent it, FDA, you know, there's a clear, how do you do that with a sociologist? Well, now with AI having progressed to where it is, it's much easier to translate my research into something technical that can then be packaged, bought, and sold. I'll give you an example. Working with several companies on AI and healthcare products. And in those meetings, I was the only social scientist in the room. It was computer scientists and medical people. And I said, okay, guys, you're talking about building a AI-driven product that helps people have healthy behaviors in their life. And you've talked about the diagnostics that need to be in there, but you've mentioned nothing about how you push people for behavioral change. So none of this will work if there's nothing that, and they're like, oh, they never even thought about it. And I said, here's research on how behavioral change happens. Let's think through how you program that into an AI tool. Boom, right? All of a sudden, I'm relevant in a way that I wasn't, because 2 years ago, it was hard to program that into something. Now you can, right?
May I also ask, like, second time you're coming not alone to the city of Lviv. It's very interesting practice. Sometimes professors travel alone, teach their class and go.
Yeah.
And you're bringing more people. So tell about this particular practice, because last year we had Peter and Masil, two of your students, and this year you're having Andrew. And tell us why you are bringing more people to Ukraine, and what is the instrument in your class you are using to share this with others?
Yeah. So, I mean, first and foremost, again, going back to research, one of the most effective things to increase success is with entrepreneurs is their network, right? Expanding their network. And so in some ways, and I do this very structurally in all my classes, I always have a lot of guest speakers. It's never just me, because I'm one node. So me coming, that increases all of the students' network, because they have access to me and all of my network. And we do as best we can to keep in contact with students, even ones that we had here last year. But if I bring more people with me, that's even more people they can connect with, right? And that's better, even better. And so I like to have hard takeaways in my classes, right? And I know that part of that isn't just the content I spew out of my mouth, it's the networks I bring to your students, okay? And what's interesting is how those people I bring with me, then they come back on their own, right? So Jake and Miss Sue, you brought up last year, they came with me in May, they came without me in August, and then Peter, he came back in January and he was here until March, right? And now I'm back and I'm bringing Andrew, and Andrew's talked about coming back, right? And I'll be back in Ukraine in September. And I think that's exactly the type of thing that we need. We need to, these are simple ways, but if you do it in mass, if more people are adopting this practice, we're increasing the network connections between Ukraine and the world. That's exactly what, a major thing that Ukraine needs right now.
That's what we need. But also, except, traveling, we have also some, I would say, the cultural gap between the cultures.
Yeah.
What would you recommend to Ukrainian students, young entrepreneurs to work on to somehow shorten this distance between the cultures? Or you can see the difference between the students in UConn, for example, at the business school and the local ones.
Yeah, I'm reflecting a bit. I think I'm also reflecting on, okay, what of the students, which students from last year am I still connected with, right? And why am I still connected with them? One key thing, and I think this is networking generally, I think it's important to connect with a person beyond work, find those commonalities that you have beyond whatever work objective you have, right? And that will help strengthen the bond, and that there's some unique experiences that you have together. So if you can early on find commonalities and values, like you said, there's cultural differences, but there's always going to be some commonalities. And if there aren't, invent them. Right? And so when you can quickly and early on in a new relationship find common values, and then find common experiences that you like to do together and have those experiences, non-work experiences, then there's higher likelihood that that tie will continue and become stronger in time. When that doesn't occur early on in the formation of a new relationship, then it's more likely to become a weak tie or dissolve over time and not fully form into a relationship like the one we have.
Yeah.
Right? You can attribute that, I think, to our commonalities that we found outside of work, right? In terms of our experiences, I think having you and your wife come and visit UConn shortly after, in July, only reinforced it, and being able to just have late nights talking, not about work.
Yeah, and I also recall this amazing dinner with your vice president on international relationships. Yeah, he told us you have to look for the real friends who will be really supporting you long term.
Yep.
So it's very important in all the reconstruction efforts to look for someone who is with you in hardships and in the very, well-developed times.
Yeah.
So it was really, really important recommendation for us. So I really want to thank you for coming, first of all, and thank you, UConn, for having this long-term relationship with us. It's really important for us. It means a lot, even in this complicated, hard time for us. And yeah, I hope for our long collaboration and
Absolutely.
more classes we can teach together. Thank you, Ryan.
Absolutely. Thank you.